Aloha, friends. Mahalo for joining us for today's Wildlife Wednesday lecture. My name is Catherine, and I am the branch manager of the Princeville Public Library on Kauai, one of the 51 libraries in the Hawaii State Public Library System. Wildlife Wednesdays is a celebration of Wildlife Refuge Week. This series is a partnership with the Kauai National Wildlife Refuge Complex, Conservation Dogs of Hawaii, USGS, the US Geological Survey, Pacific Rim Conservation, the Hawaii State Public Library System, and the Friends of Kauai Wildlife Refuges. Today, I am happy to give the virtual floor to Aisha Rickley-Rahman, the Pacific Island Refuges and Monuments Biological Science Technician, to introduce today's speaker. Aisha, the virtual floor is yours.
Hello, aloha. Mahalo for joining us for the Wildlife Wednesday lectures. My name is Aisha Rickley-Rahman, and I'm on the biology team with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Pacific Islands Refuges and Monuments Office in Honolulu, Hawaii. It is my pleasure to introduce our second presenter for the Wildlife Wednesdays series lecture. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to share why the National Wildlife Refuge System is so important. This week is National Wildlife Refuge Week, an annual event celebrating the great network of lands and waters that conserves and protects Americans' precious wildlife heritage. The refuge system protects some of the country's most iconic ecosystems while offering outstanding recreation to nearly 60 million people at its 567 national wildlife refuges and 38 wetland management units from Maine to the Marianas. Founded by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903, National Wildlife Refuges offer access to a host of popular activities while providing vital habitat for thousands of wildlife species. The service's presence in the Pacific Islands dates back to 1909, when President Theodore Roosevelt established the Hawaiian Islands National Wildlife Refuge. Today, refuge units throughout the Pacific Islands include 22 national wildlife refuges. Today, I'm happy to introduce Kyoko Johnson of Conservation Dogs of Hawaii. I had the privilege of working with Kyoko when her and another handler came with 2 dogs to search for invasive yellow crazy ants at Johnston Atoll National Wildlife Refuge. Over a span of 11 years, many volunteers, staff, and contractors worked diligently to eradicate yellow crazy ants from Johnston Atoll, the successful declaration of which finally occurred just this past June. The dog handler teams of Conservation Dogs of Hawaii went out at the very end of the eradication to search for any remaining yellow crazy ants and served as a really fantastic confirmation tool to verify what our human surveys were telling us, which was that there were no ants left in areas that had been searched. Kyoko is here to share about Conservation Dogs of Hawaii's important work across Hawaii and the Pacific. So without further ado, Kyoko, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Aisha. I'm Kyoko Johnson, and I'm with Conservation Dogs of Hawaii. Let me just do my little screen share, 1 second. Okay, can everyone see that?
Great. Yes, perfect.
So the topics that I'd like to talk about in today's presentation, first I'll start with an introduction. What is our mission as a nonprofit organization? Why dogs? Then conservation dog applications around the world, not just in Hawaii. Then I'd like to talk about some of the projects and programs that we've had in the past, that we have now, and that we are proposing for the future. And then finally, I'll talk about some information that might be helpful for our natural resource managers, biologists, and field techs who are interested in exploring the detection dog method to achieve their conservation goal. There are a lot of factors involved in doing a conservation dog project. So that's what I wanted to share. So our mission, to start with, Conservation Dogs of Hawaii was established as a nonprofit organization in 2018 as a way to assist and collaborate with local biologists and natural resource agencies in their efforts to fight invasive species, as well as locate and or protect elusive endangered species. In the face of adversity, including climate change and biosecurity threats, our mission is to have dogs become a resource of resilience for our islands. Just to tell you a little bit about the photos, that's Ruger on the left. He's part of the Devilweed invasive plant detection program, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And on the right, we have Bodhi, who worked in the 2017 avian botulism study at Hanalei National Wildlife Refuge. So that's her doing a survey in the Taro unit. So why dogs? You may have heard some of this information before, but dogs possess up to 300 million olfactory receptors in their noses compared to just 6 million in humans. The part of a dog's brain that is dedicated to analyzing smells is proportionally 40 times larger than ours. So now it makes sense why they're always sniffing the ground and sniffing people's crotches and things like that. That's how they learn about the world, is through their nose. And dogs are considered to be a non-invasive survey method. And that's one of the reasons that they're used. And they're also helpful for detecting targets at low density or that are visually undetectable to humans. So conservation dog applications are very varied and they're always changing. Some of them that you may have heard of include pre and post construction surveys and monitoring. For example, a new shopping mall is going up and they want to check an area to see if there's an endangered moth living there. Then there's invasive species detection and eradication. There's endangered species research, biosecurity, disease identification for forestry, agricultural, and botanical purposes, and wildlife trafficking. So some of the pictures that I have in here from the left, that's Bodhi again, working at a wind farm, monitoring for bats and seabird and migratory bird fatalities. In the middle, we have Andrew Glasser, who is an endangered Fio duck detection dog handler in New Zealand, and his German short-haired pointer, Fio. On the right, we have Marley, who is from the Coconut Rhinoceros Beetle Response Team here in Hawaii. I believe they're a state program in partnership with USDA, and the dogs there look for an invasive insect called the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which is devastating to palm trees. So that's Ryder there with Marley. As far as types of targets, again, they're very varied. They can go from live plants and animals, plants, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, invertebrates, mammals, insects, to carcasses of any of the above, scat, guano, frass, nests and eggs of some of those animals, fungi, diseases, and illegal wildlife parts and poaching equipment. There are also anti-poaching dogs that look for criminals, but that's a little bit different from traditional detection work. And in the photos, there's the yellow crazy ant on the left, and that's Devilweed on the right, looking a little wilted. How is CDH pursuing its mission? We have a two-pronged approach. Education is really important to us, not just educating the general public, but fellow conservation professionals. In 2019, we hosted a symposium at the Hawaii Conservation Conference, and we invited several speakers from all around the world, including Taiwan and New Zealand and the mainland. And they all spoke about their area of research or specialty, including the red imported fire ant, endangered Fio duck, rodents, the invasive rodents in New Zealand, Bandram storm petrel, which was a project in Hawaii, and the Rapidohea death, which was also in Hawaii. So that conference was very fun to participate in, just networking with other people in Hawaii who are in the conservation field, meeting the guests that we invited, and hearing all about their projects. And I believe actually that Aisha, who introduced me, had attended this symposium and heard about the ant detection dogs here. So yeah, we hope to participate in another conference at some point after the pandemic settles down. We also offer free scent detection workshops for natural resource managers, biologists, and field techs. We haven't been doing it as much lately because of the pandemic, but we hope to pick that up soon. We invite, all these people to bring their own pet dogs and learn some basic scent work games, learn how to read their dog's behaviors when they're in odor, that type of thing. And we also give a short presentation about the different ways that dogs can be used. And we end with a Q&A. And again, the idea behind that is to just introduce people who might not be familiar with the detection dog method to the basics of it. And we give presentations, podcasts, and participate in media stories whenever we can to share about the detection dog method. In fact, this presentation actually is the first one I've ever given. So I'm not a scientist or biologist or professional presenter, but I felt that it was really important to share what we do and the ways that dogs can be used. We also do hands-on work, which is quite fun. Our Nose Work for Conservation program was something we started a couple of years ago, almost as an experiment. On the side, I teach some scent work classes to pet dog owners, and they love doing it. Their dogs love doing it. And I wondered if it was something that I can combine with conservation. So we contacted the Oahu Invasive Species Committee and asked them what might be a good target for volunteer dogs to look for. And they had suggested Devilweed, which I'll talk about later. But we first started with a proof of concept project with Akia, the native plant. And sure enough, the dogs were able to learn that scent, and that went really well. So we moved on to Devilweed. The dogs in this program really serve as good ambassadors as well for the detection dog work. We get questions out in the field all the time about what we're doing. So it gives us a chance to talk about invasive species and what everyone can do to look out for it. Let's see, we also do field work that's not volunteer supported. We'll talk more about that later. So there's field work and feasibility projects. So when I say feasibility project, I mean, for example, somebody wants to know, is it possible for a dog to learn the odor of ABC? Then we might do a small test project to see if the dogs are able to learn that scent. So that's a feasibility project. And then we're always exploring new targets and applications because, it's quite frankly, it's endless, the number of things that you could potentially do with dogs. So just a quick rundown of the pictures below. The picture on the left was from Hawaii News Now about the avian botulism project. That's Julie and her dog Ula in the middle. They're part of the Devilweed invasive plant detection team. And on the right is a photo from our booth at the Hawaii Conservation Conference. And there's Lisa, our board member, in the middle, and William, trainer from Taiwan, on the right, and Andrew Glasser from New Zealand on the left. So now we're going to talk about some of our past and current projects. This picture here is from Johnston Atoll National Wildlife Refuge. That's Guinness the dog in the front. Michelle Reynolds in the background, who is Guinness's handler, Solo the lab with me on the left. So the first project I'm going to talk about is avian botulism at Hanalei National Wildlife Refuge on the island of Kauai. So that was it started as a joint collaborative study between USGS and the US Fish and Wildlife with PI Michelle Reynolds. And in 2020, the refuge established their canine program, and it was based on the study that we did a few years ago. So what is avian botulism? It's actually the most common cause of death in wild birds worldwide. And it's actually a food poisoning of the birds. And what does that mean? So on the right here, you see what is called the carcass maggot cycle. The bacteria that causes this botulism is actually quite common in the environment. However, it's when it comes together with other factors such as anaerobic conditions and a protein source and heat is when it turns toxic. So the toxin can be accumulated in maggots or invertebrates, for example. The ducks will eat those maggots, get sick, and when the bird dies, flies will lay eggs on the carcass, and then the maggots that grow out of that will become toxic as well, which then are eaten by other birds, which cause botulism as well. So it's a vicious cycle unless you remove the carcasses and protein sources that could trigger an outbreak. On the left, you see an image with the clinical signs of botulism in a bird. You'll start to see that, they can't move their wings very well. They have droopy eyelids, not able to hold their head upright, and that can cause drowning. So it's very sad. Some of the mitigation methods include, manipulating the water sources and collecting data and doing intensive searches. So dogs would come into the surveillance portion. So during the study, the purpose was to evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of the dogs in the searches. So it was kind of a two-part study. The first part included daily surveillance using the dogs, and there were like secret hidden carcasses that were put out for the dog teams to find. We never knew what day it might be or where it might be. So over time, that data was collected on how many carcasses they found and what kind of taro coverage they were found, et cetera. In the end, the surveillance results show that the humans searching on an ATV or visually, it was efficient, meaning it was very fast, but not as effective in dense vegetation. Because if you're driving fast, you most likely don't see as well. Human pedestrian searches, again, that's visual, but with people walking, it was effective, but a little less efficient, meaning it took a little bit longer than dogs. And finally, the canine assisted surveys were both efficient and effective. And in the trial results, which were a double-blind timed trials that were done at the very end of the entire project, we had 15 minutes to search for, again, hidden carcasses. And they had humans searching visually as well as canine teams. And the canine teams were 4 times more likely to find the carcasses. However, the interesting thing was that the dogs or the dog teams and the human visual searchers tended to find different carcasses because some were easier for the dogs versus some were easier for the humans visually. So combined, 7 of the 9 trials had 100% detection. So that really kind of shows you that using different methods, combining them can really help the cause. And below, I just have citation of the study that that the above information is from. So if you're interested, you can look that up online. It should be available as a link. So here we have volunteers, Deborah and Luna on the left, and Kim Rogers and Zena on the right. So they're part of the current canine program. It was a collaboration to set up this program between Conservation Dogs of Hawaii and Hanalei Refuge and these volunteers here. It's still an ongoing project, and so far, the dogs are doing great. I believe that Zena even found some sick coots hiding in the bushes that were quickly sent to Save Our Shearwaters Rehabilitation Center. And one of them was just released back into the wetlands. So that's awesome. Let's see, some of the challenges that we had to face in training dogs in this environment included there's uneven muddy surfaces. It's not that easy to walk around in when it's muddy and rainy. So that was quite challenging. And then of course there's the sensitive wildlife that you want to avoid flushing. There's nests during the breeding season that we want to avoid as well. So we have to study the nest maps and make sure we don't get too close. There's also shifty winds and lots of rain here. So environmentally, it can be challenging. But some of the workarounds that we made were to run the dogs on leash, not to bother the wildlife. And yes, it is harder to run a dog on leash because the handler has to be more in tune with the dog, make sure you don't prevent them from finding the target. But both Deborah and Kim here used to be in canine search and rescue. So they knew about dogs and dog training, which is very helpful. Let's see what else. One other thing that we had to do was circumnavigate the taro fields because we didn't want to damage the taro crops. So rather than letting the dogs go into the taro fields and search freely in there, we would go around the taro. And when the dogs gave a proximity alert from the dike saying, hey, there's something in there, then that would be the only time that we would send them into the taro to pinpoint a carcass. So that's another challenge that we faced, but we came up with we think a creative solution for. So I'm going to show a video next. That is me and Bodhi training at Hanalei National Wildlife Refuge, just so you have an idea of what I mean by giving a proximity alert and then going into the lo'i. In this case, it's not actually a taro unit, it's a wetland, a wet fallow unit, but it gives you an idea of what we do. Okay, so that was two different dogs training on the same carcass hide. And with the second dog solo, what did we do? We switched him from a head halter to a back clip harness before sending him in, just so that it wouldn't get tangled under his legs. So that's why you see him kind of, there's like a big delay in sending him in, and he's sniffing the dike when he goes in. It's actually what's called pooling odor. The odor from the carcass at a distance is kind of collecting on the bank of the lo'i, and that's what you saw him sniffing. Anyway, now we're going to move on to yellow crazy ants. Aisha talked a little bit about this project. We were very excited to be a part of this big effort. We were just a small part at the end of it, but we're glad that we were able to give them confidence to declare the island YCA free. So let's see. So this was an interesting project because it's in a remote island. It took 3.5 days to get there by boat. That's the photo in the bottom right, and 3.5 days back in the trade winds. We were all a little bit sick coming back, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife gave us a chance to go out on a day trip on the boat before the trip, so we could get the dogs ready and make sure that their seasickness medicine worked and all that kind of stuff. I think that I might be running a little bit long on the project, so on the presentation, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but The photo on the top right, that's me and Solo working with Aisha, who was not only the project lead, but also our biological shadow. In the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about bioshadows. On the top right, we have Keely and Aisha. Keely was the bioshadow for the other dog team, Michelle and Guinness. And they had a few different roles. They used their GPS tools to help navigate and determine what the coverage area will be. They also looked out for wasps and treated them so that the dog teams would not get stung by them. And they also just made sure that we were hydrated and carried some of our equipment around. It was great to have them as our biological shadows. On the top left, you see the frigate bird, and that's an example of just sensitive wildlife that you don't want to flush. A place like Johnston is really hot. If a parent leaves its chick or its egg, it could get really hot. And so the biological shadows also helped us to avoid flushing the birds as much as possible, picking the right routes. On the bottom left, we have actually my husband, Keely, and Yvonne. They did a great job clearing some of the brush for us. Because of the pandemic, there was a lot of overgrown bushes and trees, and in order to make the surveys a little bit more effective, they cleared some routes within the bushes. So thanks to all of you guys. So this is a map. The top left is the detector dog survey tracks from the very end after 13 days, I believe. So those are the lines from the dog tracks, GPS tracks. And on the bottom right, we have the estimated coverage area. And why does that look different from the tracks? Well, the dogs, they detect from a distance. So let's say if you're walking down a line and the wind is blowing from your right, then based on what the average detection distance of that target is, the dog would effectively be covering a larger area than just the line that they're walking. So this was based on the average detection distances for the dogs. And altogether, we covered 177 kilometers and over 53 hectares of treatment area in 84 hours. So this was the first time to have detection dogs in a remote wildlife atoll in the Hawaiian Islands. So that was pretty exciting, and we hope that that opens the door for other opportunities as well. So Devilweed is a program I mentioned earlier. It's supported by volunteer dog handler teams, and the surveys consist of hiking and priority trails that are assigned to us by Oahu Invasive Species Committee. We partner with them and they provide us guidance on biosecurity protocols and which areas to survey. We submit all our data to them so that they can see the spread or the control over time. And this target was chosen because it's accessible to the general public via these hiking trails. It's not something where we have to take a helicopter and rappel down cliffs or go into private property, that type of thing. So it's a great target for this program. And we've only been doing this for about 2 years, but so far we're finding that the dogs are able to detect plants up to 70 meters away. That's actually pretty surprising to even myself. I'll show you a map, a GPS map of a recent survey we did. And what you see is, for example, in the top where it says 2021-1004-03, that flag is 70 meters away from the trail, and you see the dog walking down the trail, and then suddenly they veer off and head to the target, and we find it, we pull the plant, and then we head back to the trail. So that's what a typical survey might look like. And you may have all heard that the Big Island discovered some devilweed on their island in early 2021. So we are hoping to get out there in 2022 to work with Big Island Invasive Species Committee, help with their eradication effort. So that's Kana on the bottom left. And on the top right, we have a tiny seedling that we found. So melon fly, I'll just talk about this really quickly. It's an agricultural pest that will lay its eggs inside of fruits and vegetables, such as the zucchini here. And you can't even tell that they've laid an egg. It's a tiny hole that they deposit their eggs into, but it just destroys the whole plant. It makes the entire plant weaker. And so we worked with an entomology student to see if the dogs could detect not actually the insect itself, but the volatile organic compounds that are released by the plant when they're injured by this pest. And the dogs did really well. She's working on publishing this work right now. But one thing that was interesting was that an artificially injured zucchini, like a needle poking a hole in it, did not smell the same to the dogs as the pest-caused injuries. So the signature of the VOCs was different. So I'm going to show you a video of what an odor recognition test looks like. This was a project where we just wanted to see if the dogs could detect the odor, and it's not really a field or operational project. So it's a lot simpler in that the dogs are sniffing 10 containers and they alert on one. And the controls included zucchinis that had holes poked in them, but did not have insects in them. So this is Morgan, the UH agricultural student. You see the dog alerting on that container?
Yes.
So that was a practice run where it's blind to the dog and handler. And we're really excited to be working on Seabird burrow detection starting this year. The goal is to identify areas with vulnerable seabirds so that we can target predator control strategies, whether that is trapping or predator-proof fencing. So I won't go into detail about this. This is something that we just started, but we're hoping to do this every year from now on because we feel that it's really important. The future proposed projects include a biosecurity program, screening for rodents and yellow crazy ants on resupply vessels going to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. There are a lot of other island nations and territories that do have biosecurity programs with dogs like this. So the idea is to model it after them. And the other big thing we'd love to do is down seabird surveys at hotels and other properties during fallout season. You know, the humans hopefully are finding a lot of the down seabirds, but sometimes they might be hiding in the bushes. So we think that the dogs could really help save more birds. So moving on, can dogs help your conservation effort? Well, there are a few questions. In what ways are your current survey methods effective? In what ways are your current survey methods ineffective? And can dogs fill those gaps? So I'm going to talk about a few things to consider when exploring the detection dog method for wildlife conservation. So it's important to remember that dogs are an added tool rather than a magic bullet. They're good for some applications and targets and not necessarily for others. Some target species have a very low odor threshold. And what does that mean? The dogs can learn to detect the odor, but maybe in a field environment, the odor is so faint that it's not practical to use a dog, or maybe it's not any faster than using visual methods. Unfortunately, with the rosy wolf snail, an invasive snail that we tried to work with, we found that, yes, the dogs could learn that odor, but in a field environment with a lot of leaf litter, there wasn't enough odor for the dogs to effectively detect them. And it's really unfortunate because we wanted to help in the effort to save the native snails, but unfortunately it didn't work out too well. Some environments may not be suitable. And what does that mean? For example, with seabird detection, we talked about how we had started doing that, but that was in a lava terrain. Maybe there are places where there's seabirds in vegetated areas that are not protected by predator-proof fencing. In that case, maybe doing surveys in that area would open up paths for other predators, and it might not be a suitable application, even though there's plenty of odor for the dogs to find. And sometimes the dogs do a great job and raise the detection rates drastically. At the Oahu wind farm where I worked, I believe the detection rates went from like the 50 percentile for humans searching visually to upwards of 90% when the dogs started searching. And then sometimes, of course, humans and the dogs find different targets, and so it's helpful to combine the two, and they complement each other, such as the avian botulism study that I mentioned. So in many cases, so it can be effective. It's important to conduct the projects professionally, though. Otherwise, if you take shortcuts, it may appear as if the method is not effective, but that's not necessarily the case. So if you could provide biological details as much as possible about the habits and characteristics of the target species, then your trainer or your project bidders will be able to determine dog selection criteria and training and survey strategies, and it'll help them develop a realistic budget and assess how feasible the project is. Because you have to remember that the dog people are not biologists. So the next question would be, what is your goal? We talked a little bit about some of these aspects earlier. An odor imprinting test, that might be just to see, can the dog learn this odor? It might be a proof of concept. Others have done something like it, and you want to see if we can do it locally. And sometimes it might be to determine what kind of training materials would be suitable. We spoke with some people about two-line spittlebug, which is an invasive insect that's devastating pastureland in the Big Island. And one of the questions was, well, what do we use to train? We can't use, in a large scale project, you wouldn't want to use the live insect probably because it's a biosecurity issue. So can we use the dead insect and have the dogs generalize on the live insect? Could we use the spittle? So just determining what kind of materials can be used could be a project in itself. And of course, then there's a small scale pilot project to test out how it would work in the field, and then a full-on operational project. So one of the other questions is, what is your survey environment like, and is it conducive for the canine teams? There could be all kinds of hazards, whether it's insects or unexploded ordnance or whatever, terrain, sensitive wildlife or environment, which we touched on with Hanalei and Johnston, weather conditions, transportation to and from the survey site. How long does that take? And is it possible to visit the site just to see what it's like ahead of the project? Access to medical veterinary care, all these things will kind of help determine if it's a feasible or conducive for the canine teams. Training aids. This is a big one that's very important for any canine project. So other words that are used to describe training aids are samples, scent training materials, odor imprinting materials. It's basically what we use to train the dogs to detect your target. So it could be the actual target. Let's say it's a live or a dead animal or a plant. It could be parts of it. It could be scented materials because you don't have access to the actual training aid or to the target species. But either way, the question is, do I have any available that can be provided to a dog team, or can I access new ones to provide? And then proper handling techniques are important because the dogs use their sense of smell. So you don't want the scent training materials to be contaminated with other scents, like, eating a peanut butter sandwich and then you pick up the carcass or something like that. Examples, sea turtle nest, for example, if you wanted to have dogs search for sea turtle nests, do you need an actual turtle egg to train the dog on? Perhaps, but perhaps you could use cloacal fluid in the sand because that's an indicator of an actual nest, whereas an attempted nest may not have as much of it. So it's not always necessary that you have the actual target. Related materials or associated scents could be used in some cases. So what is your timeline for the start date and completion? Just keeping in mind that training a completely new dog is going to take longer than using an experienced dog. And if your target species or application is totally new, nobody's done it, then it might take a little bit longer too, because you have to explore, can the dog learn this scent and can they find it in the field versus a known quantity like, bat and bird carcasses. A lot of dogs have been trained on that. We know what they can do. So permits is another big thing. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Is a special use permit or endangered species permit required, or will it be covered by an existing permit? And how long will it take to get a new permit or modify an existing one? So those are some things to consider as well. You might have all the training aids that you need to train the dog and you could start tomorrow, but if you don't have the permit to search the site, then it might have to be delayed. And finally, we have Canine Logistics, and I geared this towards people in Hawaii, but this could apply to any place. So in Hawaii's case, are the dogs accustomed to the heat and humidity or to the survey site factors such as the water, the mud, high elevation, and what inter island or overseas arrangements are required? Does Hawaii Department of Agriculture require rabies vaccines and titers? So those are all things to consider. And in fact, the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are not part of the state of Hawaii. So if you take dogs to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands and come back to Hawaii, you do need to do these HDOA stuff. Okay, one more slide, I forgot. So pre-trained dogs, cross-trained dogs. So with conservation being so, having such a wide range of potential targets, it's probably not possible that, this new target that you want to use dogs for already has a pre-trained dog available in the islands. It's just impossible to have, thousands of dogs, each one trained on something different. And we haven't even really explored all the new targets and applications yet. So while they might not be readily available, it is possible to train them for it. And also, if your funding or time is limited, you can train a dog on multiple targets to find multiple targets in the same location. So you could save a little bit of time with that. There are some exceptions, but for example, if you're looking for 2 species of seabirds in the same place, the dog can easily be trained on both of them as opposed to just one. So on the left here, we have Toad, who is part of the Devilweed team. Actually, all of these dogs are from the Devilweed team. We have Ula in the middle and Briar on the right. So with that, I just like to say that thank you so much for having me here today, Hawaii Public Library System, Kauai NWR Complex, and US Fish and Wildlife, and to all the people who joined us today. I'm happy to answer any questions if we still have time.
Thank you so much, Kyoko. We do have one question that came in, and just a reminder to all attendees, if you do have a question, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A. You can submit your questions and Krista and I will read them off to Kyoko. So our first question is, do the dogs overlapping the same test area interfere with the scent from the other dog?
Okay, I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Yes. Do the dogs overlapping the same test area interfere with the scent from the other dog?
Overlap the test area. So you mean like the survey area?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. No, I mean, the dogs probably do recognize all the other things that are in the environment, especially upwind of them, but they're trained to look for the target odor. So unless you have a dog that is distracted by certain things like another dog, that wouldn't be a problem. Does that answer the question?
For the attendee who submitted the question, if you have a follow-up question, please just submit it again through the Q&A and Krista or I will read it off. Our next question is, can you tell us about sniffer rats? How does this work?
Yeah, so I didn't mention that today because it's really in the early stages, but it's an idea that I had where you could put sniffer rats on a little boat or maybe even a drone, who knows, to detect, target odors. And their job would be a little bit more like a diabetic alert dog in that they're not searching or running around the environment trying to locate something. Instead, you're driving the boat or the drone. And when the rat encounters the odor that you've trained them for, they would, ring a doorbell or whatever it is you train them to alert with and let you know that the target odor is right there. So if that makes sense. They're still trained on a target odor, but instead of having them search the environment, basically it's a combination of the dog sniffing it out and you driving a boat or a drone or even a mini monster truck, I suppose. So that would be, something that might work for an environment where a dog cannot be sent in, or maybe, you can't go in there with a kayak because of whatever the environmental limitations are. So that's just one other tool that we're looking into.
I just have a follow-up question to that on the same subject. Have sniffer rats been used elsewhere?
Yes, they have. You may have heard of the mine detecting rats in Cambodia. They're African Gambian rats, I think they're huge. Actually, they're bigger than Chihuahuas, but they've been trained to detect landmines because they don't set off the mine. They also sniff out tuberculosis and some diseases, and I believe they've started training them for wildlife trafficking as well.
All right, our next question is, this feels like a crisis situation to me. How can we help get more boots and paws on the ground?
Crisis as in, you mean the conservation situation?
I believe so.
Yeah. How can we get more dogs and boots on the ground? Well, I think that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share information about how to, explore the detection dog method and what might be involved, because it might just be a little bit fuzzy for most people. So I'm happy to share this information in a PDF or something like that, if that would help agencies or biologists look into this more. Or I'm happy to also talk to people about whether it might be feasible or not. Like I mentioned, it's not always helpful to use dogs. So yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that and get back to you.
All right, next question is, how many different target odors has Solo been trained on?
Solo, let's see. I would say about 10 specifically. And with dogs, you can also teach them to generalize too. For example, when we worked at the wind farm, they didn't have access to training aids for every single migratory species that they wanted to find. So, we might have trained with a few of them, and then the dog kind of learns to generalize on other avian scents. So that's not explicitly training them on it, but the dogs can learn a lot of odors. And of course, if you don't want them to generalize, you can also do more discrimination training so that they only alert on the ones that you want them to find.
Okay, next question is, what are some of the main barriers to eco-dog efforts that come to mind?
Main barriers. Well, funding is always a big challenge, but I think that would be for any conservation effort. What are some barriers? Could the question be framed a little bit more specifically?
Oh, the attendee who submitted the question, do you mind doing a follow-up through the Q&A? I'll see if one pops up. In the meantime, we did have one also pop up through the, oh, never mind, here it is. What kind of support is missing, if besides funding?
I would guess that just lack of information or knowledge about how to go about doing a project like this. It's very different from, traditional survey methods. There's like a live animal involved in it. So I think just maybe biologists and natural resource managers might have heard about the dogs being used or, considered it, but just not knowing what steps to take next to make it happen, that might be a barrier. Or maybe concerns about dogs damaging the wildlife or, the environment. I think it's important to know that there are a lot of creative solutions for using detection dogs. It's not like, the dogs are going to run around off leash like crazy and, bother the wildlife. There are ways to prevent that, running the dogs on leash, teaching proximity alerts, using dogs that are a little bit mellower than, the type of working dog that you think about when you think of like the police dogs. So one of the dogs, Bodhi, that was in the avian botulism study, she was very mellow and kind of walked gently into the taro. And, if you were a police dog trainer, you might think, oh, no, that dog has no drive at all. But for our study, she was the perfect dog because she was very gentle, yet still very motivated to point out the target. So I guess back to the question, I think sharing with people the different ways that dogs have been used and the creative solutions that have worked, maybe that would help to open up the door a little bit.
All right, our next question is, are there specific breeds that are better than others for this type of work?
This is a common question. I would say it depends because, again, with conservation dog applications, it's so varied that you can't say one type of dog is the best for it. There might be certain breeds that are good for, off-leash field work of wide area searches. Some of the hunting breeds, like the retrievers and pointers, they do well with that because they know how to work the wind. They know how to, swoop downwind and check obstacles and whatnot, or they like working in a natural environment. And then you might have these odor imprinting projects, like I mentioned, where the dog has to check containers over and over again. Maybe a field hunting dog does not like that. And in fact, it's too boring for them. But you have dogs that are very methodical and will check containers all day, every day. So it's really varied. And I would say, depending on what your goal is, you can talk to your canine trainer about what dog might be suitable for it. I guess just to add to that, though, you would probably want to have a dog that's motivated to work for food or toy or for something. If they really have no motivation to do the work, then they might not be suited for it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, are there any further questions? Pua, in case you didn't see it, we did see your question come through. Aisha and Krista answered in the chat, and then I also answered you through the Q&A. So please just message us again if you didn't receive the answers. All right, I'm just going to give it just a few more seconds. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to submit them and we will answer. And double check the chat to make sure. We have a wonderful one, long live eco dogs, through the chat. All right, excellent. It looks like everyone got their answers. All right, so I just want to say a huge mahalo to Kyoko and Aisha and Krista and all of our wonderful partners for this program. We've had so much fun hosting these lectures, and we hope to see you all back here next Wednesday for Opeopea, the Hawaiian hoary bat with USGS. So everyone, thank you so much for coming. You will receive a link once this webinar goes live on our virtual programming YouTube. And do any of my co-panelists have anything further to say?
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. We hope to see you again and have a wonderful day.
Yes, mahalo.